Welcome to this high-level meeting side event hosted by UNAIDS and the Global HIV Prevention Coalition. I am Mia Malan from the Bekesisa Center for Health Journalism in Johannesburg, South Africa. For the next hour and a half, we will focus on the important role that leadership plays in reaching HIV prevention targets. And we've got a panel of 12 high-level speakers lined up who will share their views and also spotlight examples of leadership that have moved the needle in the HIV prevention response. I'm going to introduce each panelist just before they speak, and in the interest of time, I'm only going to introduce them by the name and the title. But if you'd like to know a little bit more about them, you can do so by reading their bios in the HLM in-event platform app, and we have posted the link to that app in the chat box on your Zoom screen. But first, a bit of background. It's been 5 years since member states signed the political declaration in 2016 on ending AIDS. By signing this document, countries committed to collectively work towards reducing the world's annual number of new HIV infections to fewer than 500,000 by 2020. But we failed to reach that target. In 2019, 1.7 million people were infected with HIV, and most of them were adolescent girls and young women, and also people from other key population groups, such as gay men and other men who have sex with men, sex workers, injecting drug users, and transgender people. Now, all of this happened despite us having access to an excellent array of HIV prevention interventions. But unfortunately, none of these prevention options got close to being delivered to even half the people who needed them. And the COVID-19 pandemic brought even further difficulties, shutting HIV prevention services and driving up HIV infection drivers, such as gender-based violence and poverty. Now, a high-level meeting that will start directly after this event will discuss and adopt a new political declaration that will guide the future direction of our AIDS response for the next few years. Our panel today is going to address the gaps in prevention programs, but they're also going to look at the most effective ways to invest in prevention efforts, and they will also share experiences on how this can be done on a country level, and also how we can speed up the introduction of new prevention options. I'm going to ask each panelist one question to which they have 3 minutes to answer, and after that, we will move to invited comments from participants. Just before we start, if you would like to make use of the interpretation services for this event, you can go to the bottom of your Zoom window, and next to the share icon, you will see an interpretation icon. And you can click on that icon and choose the language you would like to hear. And the icon will then transform into the selected language. If you'd like to change the language again, just click on that icon again as you've done previously. So we're going to start off now with Natalia Canham, who is the Executive Director of the United Nations Population Fund. Dr. Canham, as the convener of the Global HIV Prevention Coalition, what does prevention leadership mean to you, and why are we having this conversation now?
Well, thank you so much, Mia, and greetings, everyone. The march continues to make sure that we succeed in preventing HIV. And the reason we're talking about prevention is because, for the most part, we're falling short. There were indeed 1.5 million new infections last year, and that's 3 times the target that we had for 2020. And let me just stress that it is key populations who are most at risk, along with their sexual partners, and who accounted for about 60% of adults who were newly infected the prior year, 2019. But the policies, and I have to say that the stigma that attaches to a condition which we all know is now chronically treatable and has no bearing in terms of the stigma that attaches to it, bars populations from being able to access what they need, from being able to access the drugs and the commodities. So the policies and the practices that bar people from seeking care is part of the prevention dilemma. This is part of the reason that we see growing epidemics in at least 33 countries. It's also very sad to say that adolescent girls and young women on the African continent account for 1 in 4 of the new HIV infections. And this is despite representing just 10% of the overall population. So I just have to say that 40 years into this epidemic, we cannot lean on the excuse that prevention is complicated. It is not. Leadership means to me that everyone steps up. But more and more, what leadership has to mean is that people affected have to be entrusted to have the resources, the funding, and the strategy that we follow to success. Leaders also in government, I think, have a huge role in terms of clarifying what I said earlier about the social change issues, about defending the rights of key populations, making sure that health and well-being of everyone, including the most vulnerable, are not left behind. So ultimately, I think we all have to raise our voices and speak truth. Change should not be seen as an attack on society or culture. It's not. Respect for everyone in all our sexual diversities is part of the human experience and should be embraced as such. And we should not look away from the evidence. That's my final point on this, Mia, that when we ignore the noise and create an environment that actually accelerates action, when we commit to change, when we allow young people to step up and lead, all of this is going to lead to that change in policy and law that ensures that everyone has access to information. This is how we succeed on prevention. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those valuable thoughts on leadership, Dr. Cunningham. We're going to move on to Ambassador Neville Gitze, who is the permanent representative of Namibia to the United Nations. Mr. Gitze, you were co-facilitator today of the high-level meeting. What does leadership in HIV prevention look like within the global diplomacy space, and is it shaping up?
Mia, good morning, and thank you for having us on this important day to discuss this important topic. Dr. Cunningham has just given us really a fantastic overview of what it takes for us to move forward and to help us meet the targets that we have set for ourselves for 2030. Of course, this year it is 40 years since the first case of AIDS was reported. And it's also 25 years since the joint United Nations program on HIV and AIDS, an innovative joint United Nations approach, commenced its valuable work. 20 years ago, the United Nations General Assembly convened its first ever special session to address a pandemic that was causing death and devastation on a tremendous scale, overwhelming communities and health systems. AIDS was an unprecedented global challenge, and it was met with global solidarity and action. I consider that as an example of leadership. Through the adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its Sustainable Development Goals in September 2015, heads of state and government made a bold commitment to ending the epidemic of AIDS by 2030. In a few hours, we are going to open the 4th high-level meeting on AIDS. Ahead of the meeting, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned us that despite intensive action and progress made against HIV in some places and population groups, HIV epidemics continue to expand in others. The Secretary General's report raised the alarm that we have failed to achieve the HIV prevention targets and that we need to do more moving forward. I consider that as leadership from him to bring this to the attention of all of us. The HLM, today's high-level meeting, lays the basis for the United Nations system and member states' commitment. So it is leadership in action, in my opinion. In this meeting, as referred to by Dr. Cunningham just now, we are all focused on the critical need to lead on HIV prevention in order to get the 2030 targets and the end of AIDS. Over the past 11 years, we have made significant progress on initiatives to expand and scale up prevention. One of the most marked priorities has been scaling up of domestic funding to the HIV response, which is critical to our global prevention strategy. We need to make the 2021 high-level meeting be the springboard for this renewed attention to HIV prevention and a decade of bold action to scale up HIV prevention programs and to reduce inequalities and root out the social determinants that fuel the HIV epidemic. Lastly, the UN and the high-level meeting brings together the renewed commitment and engagement of world leaders, of countries, of communities, and of all our partners to make this happen. So in summary, the global diplomacy space is taking action, and yes, it is shaping up. But the time for renewed focus and bold action on HIV prevention is now. We have not met the targets of 2016. We now need to do more, because if there is no HIV prevention, there will be no end to this epidemic. I thank you.
Thank you for your thoughts about HIV prevention in the global diplomacy space, Mr. Getze. Our next speaker is Mr. Mitchell Warren, who is the Executive Director of AVAC and also the co-chair of the Global HIV Prevention Coalition. Mr. Warren, as someone who heads up an organization which has played a strong role in advocating for HIV prevention in the civil society space, what are the two things that you think we could have done better and what we need to change to do differently in order to bring down new infections to less than 400,000 per year by 2025?
Mia, thank you so much for your moderation of this session and for helping the Global Prevention Coalition bring the critical pieces of prevention to the conversation. And I want to thank the speakers before me, and particularly the conveners of the development of the political declaration. These are important moments as we look, and if we look to 2016, to get to your question, we saw really ambitious targets, first developed in the UNAIDS strategy 5 years ago, and then enshrined in the political declaration of 2016. And targets are critically important. But if we look back on the last 5 years, we know that while we have made significant progress in reaching people with testing and with antiretroviral treatment, as we must, we have failed miserably in reaching the primary prevention targets. And we need to look at that critically as we embrace new targets this week with the political declaration, recommitting us to trying to get, as you said, to fewer than 400,000 new infections by 2025. To do that means we've got to act differently. We cannot just continue as we have. Targets are important, but we've got to develop the programs and the policies and the leadership at all levels to deliver on those. So what has gone wrong? Well, most of all, I would say two things. One, we need to recognize that HIV has always required a comprehensive, integrated, and sustained agenda. And we haven't seen that in primary prevention. And we have seen prevention squeezed to just receive what's left over after we scale up testing and treatment programs. This is not an either-or equation. We have to scale up testing and treatment programs and scale up primary prevention, because no one intervention, no one activity is going to reach all people at all points in their lives, both people who are already infected with HIV and people who are not yet infected. Second, we need a people-centered approach. You know, primary prevention is not just products. It's not just condoms. It's not just PrEP. It's not just voluntary medical male circumcision. Those are critical components. And we see those and newer interventions designed rightly around the virus. That's how product development and science works. But we have to design the programs around the people. We actually know this from 40 years of HIV, but we are tragically reminded of it just in these last 18 months with SARS-CoV-2. Even with remarkable, breathtaking progress in the science of vaccine development in COVID, vaccines don't end epidemics. Vaccination programs do, and it's true in HIV as well. We tend to get so focused on the products that we forget, as the ambassador just said, the structural drivers, the systematic issues. And they absolutely have to be grounded in the people who we seek to serve. And the opportunities are growing as we see new options beyond the prevention options we have today with the vaginal ring, injectable PrEP, both interventions that may be with us very soon. But those are what science develops as new options. But we need the policy, the leaderships, and the programs to provide these as actual choices to people. Science develops options. Our leadership, our policies, and our programs make those choices or provide those as choices to people. And that takes leadership at all levels. I just want to underscore as I close that, we think a lot about leadership this week at the high level meeting, and political leadership has never been more important in countries that have epidemics. And that's true in every country, in reaching people in greatest need. And those are often people who are marginalized and criminalized and stigmatized. So political leadership matters. The world is watching, but the world isn't just watching ambassadors and ministers and heads of state at the UN. They're watching all of us in civil society, because community leadership matters. Community need to drive programs. They need to drive what programs and policies can deliver. It's not just one group of people any more than it's not just one intervention. So I guess in closing, Mia, I'd say we can't get stuck in this idea that one thing is going to be our answer to the AIDS response. It has always needed a comprehensive, integrated, and sustained response. And we need to recommit to that today with people at the center.
Thanks so much for your reflections, Mr. Warren, and for pointing out that both political and community leadership are important. We're now going to hear from Dr. Nguyen Tan Long, who is the Minister of Health in Vietnam. Dr. Long, Vietnam has one of the highest rates of HIV transmission through injecting drug use, but you have had success in preventing new infections through the introduction of methadone maintenance therapy programs. But harm reduction programs can be very controversial. So if you could give advice to other government leaders about how to scale up such programs, what would that be?
Vâng, xin trân trọng cảm ơn bà. Kính thưa các quý vị đại biểu, trước hết tôi rất là cảm ơn tất cả những các quý vị đã cho tôi được cơ hội để trao đổi, chia sẻ những cái bài học kinh nghiệm trong vấn đề về kiểm soát thành công đối với vấn đề về lây nhiễm HIV trong nhóm nghiện trích ma túy. Có thể nói rằng là cách đây 15 năm, khi mà dịch HIV của Việt Nam đang đứng ở cái giai đoạn điểm rất là cao, mỗi một năm chúng tôi phát hiện ra hơn 30 đến 40 ngàn trường hợp nhiễm HIV, và trong đó khoảng độ 70% các trường hợp nhiễm có liên quan đến sử dụng ma túy. Và tại thời điểm đó, chính phủ Việt Nam cũng đã quyết định triển khai những cái chương trình can thiệp trong nhóm về nghiện trích ma túy, để từ đó có thể hy vọng khống chế và kiểm soát thành công đối với cái đại dịch trong cái thời điểm này. Thời điểm đó thì cái tỷ lệ mà lây nhiễm trong cái nhóm nghiện trích ma túy lên tới 30%, có nghĩa rằng là 10 người thì có 3 đến 4 người là bị nhiễm HIV. Nhưng đến thời điểm hiện nay thì con số này đã giảm xuống còn ở mức độ rất là thấp, và cái tỷ lệ hiện nhiễm hàng năm là chỉ vào khoảng 0,4%. Có rất là nhiều những cái bài học kinh nghiệm mà chúng tôi đúc rút từ vấn đề về thực tiễn, cũng như là triển khai các hoạt động về phòng chống HIV trong nhóm này. Cái bài học đầu tiên chúng tôi cho rằng đó là sự lãnh đạo chỉ đạo của các cấp chính quyền và sự quyết tâm về mặt chính trị. Chúng tôi cho rằng đây là một cái điều rất là quan trọng. Từ quyết tâm chính trị đó, chúng ta làm thay đổi cái nhận thức của các cấp lãnh đạo, thay đổi nhận thức của các bộ, các ban ngành, và đặc biệt là thay đổi nhận thức của người dân, và chấp nhận nghiện ma túy như là một bệnh, và từ đó chúng ta điều trị, mang tính điều trị về mặt y học. Vấn đề thứ hai, chúng tôi cho rằng tại thời điểm đó chúng tôi đã triển khai rất quyết liệt đối với chương trình trao đổi bơm kim tiêm để phân phát và sử dụng bơm kim tiêm sạch. Nên chúng tôi nhớ lại hàng năm con số về bơm kim tiêm sạch có thể lên tới 30 triệu cái bơm kim tiêm sạch được phân phát cho cái đối tượng nghiện trích ma túy ở tất cả các địa điểm. Và chúng tôi đã sử dụng những cái chương trình trao đổi bơm kim tiêm sạch hết sức là sáng tạo, đưa bơm kim tiêm sạch dựa vào cộng đồng để cho cộng đồng có thể phân phát cho nhóm người nghiện. Thế vấn đề tiếp theo là chúng tôi cũng đã triển khai cái bài học tiếp theo là triển khai cái chương trình về điều trị nghiện các chất dạng thuốc phiện bằng thuốc thay thế methadone. Đây là một trong những chương trình mà khi triển khai gặp rất nhiều những cái trở ngại, đặc biệt là những cái vấn đề quan điểm về nhận thức, quan điểm vấn đề về người nghiện, và quan điểm về vấn đề về thuốc gây nghiện. Lúc đó thì chúng tôi lại phải giải thích làm thế nào để có thể người dân người ta hiểu được là vấn đề về điều trị nghiện các chất dạng thuốc phiện bằng thuốc thay thế là một trong những cái thành tựu và một trong những cái chương trình can thiệp có cái hiệu quả giúp cho những cái người nghiện rất là nhiều. Và thực sự chúng tôi đã bắt đầu thử nghiệm vào năm 2008 và sau đó chúng tôi tiến hành đánh giá những cái độc lập để chứng minh cái hiệu quả của chương trình này. Và những cái hiệu quả của nó mang lại lúc đầu không phải chỉ là vấn đề về mặt y học, là vấn đề về an ninh an toàn trật tự xã hội, là vấn đề về cải thiện công ăn việc làm, là vấn đề về cải thiện những cái quan hệ xã hội của nhóm người nghiện ma túy. Và từ đó cho đến thời điểm hiện nay, chúng tôi đã mở rộng cái chương trình về điều trị methadone cho tất cả các địa phương và có tới hơn 50.000 người nghiện đã được sử dụng những cái thuốc thay thế bằng cái thuốc methadone. Đây là một cái chương trình chúng tôi cho rằng nó có hiệu quả về mặt sức khỏe, về mặt kinh tế, rồi về mặt xã hội rất là nhiều. Thế rồi là một cái vấn đề mà chúng tôi đặt ra một cái kinh nghiệm triển khai thì chúng tôi cho rằng muốn triển khai một cách bền vững thành công là phải triển khai rất là đồng bộ nhóm giải pháp về can thiệp trong nhóm nghiện trích ma túy, là chương trình trao đổi bơm kim tiêm, là chương trình methadone, là chương trình điều trị PrEP, tức là điều trị dự phòng cho những cái nhóm này, và làm sao để cho những cái nhóm người nghiện ma túy người ta tự bộc lộ mình. Thế rồi người ta tiếp cận với các dịch vụ xét nghiệm và người ta điều trị ở mức độ sớm nhất. Và Việt Nam hiện nay cũng được đánh giá là một cái quốc gia là có cái tỷ lệ về điều trị tốt nhất, và tức là hiệu quả điều trị tốt nhất. Thế rồi là chúng tôi cũng đã triển khai tất cả những cái hoạt động mang tính hỗ trợ đối với nhóm người nghiện ma túy. Thế rồi là phối hợp tất cả những cái bộ, ban, ngành ở trung ương, rồi các địa phương, và huy động cộng đồng, cũng huy động cho từng người dân giúp đỡ cho nhóm người nghiện ma túy. Chương trình mà can thiệp người nhiễm HIV trong nhóm người nghiện ma túy của Việt Nam có rất là nhiều các bài học, và từ cái bài học thành công đó chúng tôi thấy rằng là cần phải triển khai mạnh mẽ, quyết liệt tất cả các biện pháp can thiệp đối với nhóm này thì chúng ta mới có thể khống chế thành công đối với nhóm này. Chúng tôi xin được trân trọng cảm ơn tất cả các quý vị đại biểu, và Việt Nam hiện nay chúng tôi đang phấn đấu tới phải đạt mục tiêu là 95 và sẽ kết thúc đại dịch AIDS vào năm 2030. Xin được chúc sức khỏe tất cả các quý vị đại biểu.
Thanks very much for that, Dr. Long. We are now going to hear from Nigeria, where Dame Pauline Talon is the Minister of Women's Affairs. Dame Talon, my question to you is, gender-based violence and social or structural inequalities negatively affect the health of women, and it also undermines HIV prevention efforts. So I would like to know how you and your ministry provided leadership to address gender imbalances that contribute to the spread of HIV.
Thank you very much. Good morning to all of you. This afternoon here in Nigeria. I want to thank you for this question, and I also want to thank you for inviting me to be part of this high-level meeting site event. As the Minister of Women Affairs in Government of Nigeria, an office I assumed in August 2019, my primary responsibility, as articulated by Mr. President in his 9-point priority projects for the ministry, is to mitigate gender inequalities in the political, economic, social, and environmental realms in Nigeria. My experience in various positions in government and my closeness to the grassroots reinforces the importance of political leadership built on teamwork to help end the AIDS epidemic. I was also once a board chairman of the National Agency for the Control of AIDS in 2019 to 2018 to 2019, just before my appointment as the Minister of Women Affairs. Government is concerned by the fact that new HIV infections declined too slowly between 2010 and 2019, with gender inequalities as major contributing factors to the slow decline. National surveys have also shown an increase in gender-based violence from 2013 to 2018, and the cases of rape and gender-based violence spiked in an unprecedented manner during the COVID-19 lockdown. The video is not showing. As Minister of Women Affairs, I have worked collaboratively with to raise national consciousness on the urgent need to address gender-based violence and the root causes of gender-based violence and other inequalities, leading to significant effort in the rollout of joint programs in education, agriculture, health, environment, security, architecture, sports, and other sectors. The inauguration of an interministerial gender-based violence management committee to provide a synchronized approach to address all forms of violence against women and children in the country under the directive of Mr. President. We also have a high-level profile declaration of zero tolerance for gender-based violence by Mr. President, governors, and all their spouses. We set up a gender-based violence reporting situation room and a dashboard to collect and harmonize gender-based violence data at national and subnational levels, for which we are honored to have the UN Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed, launched it in 2020. There's increase in the number of states domesticating the Child Rights Act of 2003 and the Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act of 2015. We have sustained male engagement as key to achieving gender equality, with the He for She Awards being conferred on men in leadership, starting with the President, the Senate President, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and governors who have demonstrated outstanding support and commitment to the advancement of women in the country. We also launched the National Sex Offenders Register and a referral pathway, that is to name and shame offenders. We also commissioned the remodeled safe space for victims and survivors of gender-based violence in the country, and have also urged state governments to do the same at the subnational level. Strengthening engagement and participation of women's groups, including network of women living with HIV/AIDS, to advocate, empower, and provide services to women at the community level. We have also facilitated programs aimed at reducing gender-based violence inequalities. For instance, we are partnering with UNAIDS, UN Women, and the National Agency for Control of AIDS, which is NACA, through the One UN Basket Fund to respond to gender-based violence and prevention of COVID-19 by providing cash transfer, personal protection equipment, kits, and sanitizers to vulnerable women. Empowering women to produce face masks and hand sanitizers. Launching a hotline for reporting gender-based violence in the country. Ladies and gentlemen, the COVID-19 pandemic has set us even further off track by reducing access to HIV prevention services and fueling human rights violation. Gender-based violence, poverty, and other drivers of new HIV infections. I am aware of the fragility of the HIV prevention response and the risks we face of self-reversal of our hard-earned gains. In conclusion, I intend to tackle these challenges by championing increased participation of the Federal Ministry of Women Affairs and its state counterparts in the multi-sectoral HIV response in Nigeria to put vulnerable women and girls at the center of HIV response. Sustain investment and incremental budgetary provision for the issues of HIV prevention for vulnerable populations, including women and girls. Implementation of relevant protective policies and laws that have been passed by government while advocating for removal of institutional barriers that undermine gender-based violence and gender inequality. Education and empowerment of women and girls in their diversity to reduce their risk and vulnerability to HIV. The time to act is now, and we must all speak out. We must raise our voices to speak against gender-based violence and to ensure that we meet our targets set towards 2030. We must all rise up as leaders to speak, and the time is now. We are fully committed to act and to intensify advocacy. I thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Dame Talon, and congratulations with your country's achievements. We're now going to hear from the Global Fund to Fight HIV, AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria. And we're fortunate to have the Executive Director, Mr. Peter Sands, on our panel. Mr. Sands, we first learned about precision medicine, and now there's something called precision prevention in public health. Can you explain a little bit more about how this works and why does it make investment sense?
Thanks, Mia, and thanks to UNAIDS and the other members of the Global HIV Prevention Coalition. It's a privilege to be talking with such alongside such great panelists today. Precision prevention. What does it mean and why do we need it? Precision prevention reflects the fact that the dynamics of HIV infection are not uniform, that the transmission dynamics and thus the needs of particular communities vary according to those different communities, whether it's men who have sex with men or adolescent girls and young women or transgender or people who inject drugs. The things that need to be done to support those communities and give them the tools to reduce HIV infection are different. And so we need to tailor the interventions to the needs of the communities. In a way, precision prevention is nothing different from what we've been talking about for many years around differentiated service in the context of testing and treatment. It's just reflecting the same, in a sense, heterogeneity of the epidemic in the prevention space. I think sometimes people worry that when we talk about precision prevention, we're talking about it as if it's an alternative to scaling up interventions. It isn't an alternative. We absolutely need to scale up interventions, whether it's for PrEP or self-tests or the new vaginal ring or VMMC. There are huge needs out there if we are to meet the objectives of the UNAIDS latest strategy, if we are to really step up the pace of prevention in the way that we need. But given the scale of the needs, we know we are going to face financing gaps, particularly in the context of the current crisis, which absolutely reinforces the imperative to make every dollar, every intervention we make as effective as possible. And generalized, not specific, broad interventions, experience has told us that these don't work as well, that we need to be extremely specific and therefore precise in the interventions we make. Now, two things are really necessary if we're to make precision prevention a reality. The first is data. We need really to understand what is going on in terms of channels of transmission and also how effective interventions are. And we need that data to be fast so that we can act in real time to scale up the things that aren't working, to scale down and reallocate resources away from things that aren't working or change or modify them. So data is absolutely critical. But the other critical aspect is the active involvement and leadership of the communities that are most at risk, because it's the communities themselves that know what needs to be different, what needs to be precise to actually make these interventions work. So precision prevention isn't a silver bullet. It isn't going to overnight transform the way we do things, but it is a recognition of the fact that we don't face just one type of problem here. Preventing, reducing infections of HIV means doing different things for the different communities most at risk. It does mean scaling up, but it also means making sure we extract absolutely the maximum benefit for every dollar we commit. The Global Fund is looking to do both in the next round of grants, the round of grants that we have just launched, both scaling up our prevention interventions and making them more precise and more effective, working, of course, alongside with our partners. So that is why precision prevention makes a lot of sense in a context where collectively we need to achieve much more on HIV prevention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sands, for demystifying precision prevention for us. We're now going to hear from the Netherlands, where Pascal Groetenhuis is the Director for Social Development and also the Ambassador for Women's Rights and Gender Equality for the Netherlands. Ms. Groetenhuis, sexual and reproductive health and rights is a critical platform to promote and to ensure HIV prevention. But HIV prevention should be addressed together with sexual health to be most effective. But in many respects, such as contraceptive services, we don't yet see this. How do we address these imbalances?
Well, thank you very much for this question, and good morning, good afternoon to you all. It's a very good question, a very broad question. I would like to highlight 3 ways to address these imbalances. I think the first one is that we should invest in adolescent girls and young women and be pragmatic. We need to strengthen HIV services within the sexual and reproductive health and rights services. It is common sense, and I feel it's a smart investment in the prevention to the spread of HIV. As Dr. Kane mentioned earlier, adolescent girls and young women account for 25% of the new infections in sub-Saharan Africa. But still, dedicated HIV prevention programs are lacking, even in places with high HIV incidence among young women. During my time as ambassador in Mozambique, I experienced why. Health workers in the clinics are way too busy. Medical doctors and nurses have added responsibilities, but no additional time. In many countries, for an HIV consultation, there are only 60 seconds, but for family planning, 3 minutes. There's also a shortage of staff. I think you need complementary support from civil society and community-based organizations. Many girls I met did not consider themselves to be at risk of an HIV infection, nor did they feel empowered to discuss safe sex with their boyfriends. So comprehensive sexuality education should have our focus. The second point I would like to make is what we call the double Dutch approach to contraception. In the Netherlands, we have a dual protection of unwanted pregnancies and sexual transmitted diseases, including HIV. This is known as the double Dutch approach to contraception, a combined use of pills and condoms. If you go to a family planning clinic and you get a contraceptive, you still need to know that those pills will not protect you from HIV. So I feel that we need a double Dutch global approach to contraception. And third, but really important, in the end, we need to talk about sex. We are sexual beings, including adolescent girls and young women. For young women and girls in all the diversity, SRHR comes down to bodily autonomy. Sex is part of life and of HIV. And as my minister said during the general debate, sex should be safe and enjoyable for everyone. In the family planning clinics, we need not to shy away from talking about sexuality. We need to recognize the reality of lives. Handing out 3 months contraceptive doses, while in the meantime, a lot of happening in your sexual life is not effective. And in terms of leadership, we need to do something different. We should take the responsibility to make that change. And we shouldn't be afraid to talk about sexuality. It's a life-saving intervention. As the Dutch Ambassador for Women's Rights and Gender Equality, we are fully engaged to ensure young women and girls in all their diversity have access to SRHR services, which includes HIV prevention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Groetenhuis. We are now going to move on to Lord Norman Fowler, who is a former Lord Speaker in the United Kingdom government, and he's also a United Nations, a UNAIDS ambassador. Lord Fowler, I'd like to ask you about tackling criminalization and stigmatization of LGBTQ communities. What was this journey like for the United Kingdom, and what reflections might there be for other parts of the world?
Mia, thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me. I think one of the short answers to your question is that if we're about changing attitudes, we can't be successful unless, in many ways, we change the law, and we have all party groups that can press not only for changes in law but also for continuation. As you say, I served in the British government as health minister for 6 years in the 1980s, very much at the start of the AIDS crisis. What has struck me has been, over the years, the undoubted progress that has been made in Britain since then. And it's worth asking the question, why? Britain had a very bad history as far as equal rights was concerned. The 19th century was infamous for the punitive laws against homosexuality, which we passed on to far too many other countries. And it was not just the 19th century. Alan Turing, who had made an indelible contribution to victory in the Second World War, was hunted down and prosecuted for no other offence than being a gay man. It was not until 1967 that homosexuality ceased to be a criminal offence, but attitudes were not so easy to change. The public had been used to being told that homosexuality was against the law and therefore it was wrong. So when we came to AIDS in the 1980s, many of the old attitudes remained. We had the Chief Constable of Manchester, for example, who was there to uphold the law, talking about gay people with AIDS swirling around in a cesspit of their own making. But what we didn't always recognize at the time was that opinion was changing. Of course, it did not change overnight, but there were now many more people prepared to stand up and defend the rights of gay people, not by any means all of them gay themselves. It became a question of justice and fairness. It also became a very important step in the fight against this new disease, AIDS. One of those powerful barriers, has already been said, to people coming forward for testing has been the fear of stigma. Once homosexuality was accepted by the law, that barrier reduced. In Britain, it further reduced when a few years ago, equal marriage was accepted as a measure approved by big majorities in both the House of Commons and, perhaps even more surprising, the traditional House of Lords. None of this means, of course, that the position in Britain is ideal. Far from it. There is still prejudice. There are still politicians who will turn the other way rather than get involved. Yet for all that, the change in the country since the 1980s has been profound. Partly this has been because of the campaigning work of voluntary groups, partly because of the work of international bodies like UNAIDS. Above all, however, it has been because of the change in law. The law shows the standard which the public are expected to observe. Not, of course, everybody follows that, but the majority do. Above all, the law says that discrimination against LGBTQ people is wrong. It also recognizes that prejudice kills, whereas equality saves lives and makes everyone safer. That is the case for decriminalization.
Thank you, Lord Fowler. We're going to hear from Eswatini now, where Dr. Kanya Mabuza is the Executive Director of the National Emergency Response Council on HIV and AIDS. Dr. Mabuza, Eswatini came close to achieving its 2020 HIV prevention targets, and your government wants to further reduce infections. How is Eswatini creating national systems that would help the government to achieve its 2025 HIV prevention targets?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good morning. Good afternoon, colleagues. And thank you for the opportunity to share the experience of the Kingdom of Eswatini. In the next 3 minutes, I'll explain how we have managed to achieve the results that we are talking about today. and then how are we planning to reach the targets, particularly targets 2030 as a country. I think first and foremost, I think we all recall that the Kingdom of Eswatini was one of the countries in the world that was hit hard by HIV in the early days. At some point, the HIV incidence rate was standing at about 6%. And we're happy today that our incidence rate is at 2%, which means we have really pushed the prevention agenda. The question is like, how have you reached so close to the 75 targets on prevention? We're sitting at 66%. We have missed the targets by 15% or so. There are things that we have done as a country, and there's things that we have learned, and there are also efforts that we need actually to push for us to be able to meet the 2030 agenda. Firstly, I think what we did as a country is for the leadership to take decisive actions when it comes to HIV. Actions that meant that we all are galvanized, we are focused, we have common goal, we're looking at this thing from one angle and one direction. We focus, we put our efforts together. The tone was quite strong, I mean, from all angles. The lesson that we learned is like, for us to be able to reach the 2030 targets, the things that we should continue with. Firstly, the leadership. The leadership in Eswatini is so committed, and the commitment, it's actionable. It's something that is tangible. That's something that you can see. So we need to have actionable decisions that will lead us to ending AIDS. So for instance, as an example, the head of state, who is His Majesty the King, in the past 6 years, there is no way he make the speech from the throne, which is the speech which is made when he opens parliament, where he doesn't emphasize the need to stop the new infections. He talks about HIV, and he commands all the ministries responsible that they must work hard to ensure that we end AIDS. Our goal was to end AIDS by 2022. I think the world will remember that we were a bit ambitious. People felt that we would not be able to end AIDS, but I'm happy to report that we're one of the first countries to reach the goal 95, 95, 95. And the recent studies show that we are even above that. So my point here is the political commitment, which is very important. The second point is like, how then will the country work, given that we have achieved such achievements? We would like to really call for us to continue working in a three-pronged approach in terms of coordination. We believe that the 3-1 principle, which was initiated by the UNAIDS some time ago, did work for the country. How are you positioning HIV in terms of leadership? In the Kingdom of Eswatini, HIV sits in the highest office of government, which is the Prime Minister's office, whereby he commands in chief on the roles and actions that each ministry should take. So we believe that the 3-1 principle for us will work. We also fully believe that we need to strengthen our coordination, and this coordination should not be a top-down approach. What was worked in the Kingdom of Eswatini is our approach has primarily been community-based approach, which is the bottom-up approach, where we're using community gatekeepers, we're using communities themselves, we're using people living with HIV, and it's inclusive to KPIs. The other thing which is extremely important for decision-making and moving forward with the HIV response and how the Kingdom of Eswatini has managed, it's the use of science, data, and research for decision-making. So one of the most important things that Eswatini uses was one of the first countries where we use a population-based survey, which was a direct survey where we're looking at incidents, we're also looking at the prevalences, and also use the integrated behavioral surveillance studies, which we call IBBS. These studies, they help because what we do with the studies, we talk to the studies from the science point of view, but they must influence policy making. So most of our programming and our decision in terms of policy formulation, they are influenced by data. And this empirical data is the one actually that has pushed us to be where we are. So we believe that we need to look at the science, which is in our hands. We don't have as much science information as we used to have some 20 years ago. Now we've got rich information in our hands. It's a question of how do you convey it to our decision makers and policymakers. So we are faced with things that, like for instance, with COVID actually has eroded some of the efforts or the gains that we have made in HIV. The Kingdom of Eswatini conducts the HIV Recent Information Surveillance, which we call EHRIS. This is where you look at the recent infections. It shows that with the COVID and the lockdown, we have picked new infections. So with all this information, it shows that there's a need to look at how best we can match. It shows that there's a need to mainstream HIV and the COVID intervention.
Dr. Mabuza?
The other point...
Dr. Mabuza, sorry to interrupt. You've got 1 minute left.
Hello?
Yes, I'm sorry to interrupt. You've got 1 minute left.
Okay. The other point, which is very important for us to ensure that we move forward with the HIV, is to ensure that we mainstream HIV. We do not have the resources and the leverage that we used to have. So we want to ensure that HIV prevention is mainstream in the different sectors, primarily working closely with the Ministry of Health and pushing the treatment as prevention as a component. So we've got a very strong treatment program, which we believe that if we push prevention, we're going to have a fair viral suppression and your viremic population is going to drop. Hence, we are going to be reducing the new infections. With that, let me conclude to say that as we are standing now, we have a strong program, which is an HIV policy, which we believe, and strategy, which we believe is going to take us to Vision 2025. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mabuza, and thank you for also pointing out the real value of political commitment. We now going to hear from Paraguay, where Mr. Simon Gazal is the director of Somos Gay. And Mr. Gazal, data show us that to be successful, we need to specifically focus on prevention among gay men and other men who have sex with men. What kind of leadership is needed to scale up key population-led prevention, and how is this playing out?
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good day to everyone. Thank you for creating this reflection space. Responding to the first part of the question, I think that scaling just to HIV, gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men will require more than ever a very creative, honest, and overall courageous leadership to move forward. The HIV epidemic continues to be a public health problem in our global community simply because the Western norm imposed through the colonization to all the territories of the world is still reluctant to recognize that its conception of sexuality, pleasure, and the way in which it organizes society around these issues, it is the reason why our populations are more vulnerable and still suffering for several converging epidemics that continue to rob us of being and cost us lives throughout the world. The leadership is one that recognizes this damage and the consequences of that damage at a global level. This recognition is essential to think about how to respond and solve the consequences of that damage. Unfortunately, our current options are very limited. The approach used in programs still continues to take a extractivist form. It continues to hold and challenge a racist colonial paradigm and a series of ideas that ignores the intersectional oppressions that LGBTI+ people suffer throughout the world. For us, what appears to be most urgent is urgently recognizing that there is a damage that has to be repaired and put resources into implementation of programs that aim to do that. Without these steps, there is no amount of words, discourses, and that will solve our needs. And it is difficult, not to say impossible, to look to a sustainable future in which it is no longer a public health problem and a source of pain for so many of us. It is only with hope and a lot of courage that I think we can move forward together. I will thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Our last speaker is going to be from Kenya, and Ms. Joyce Ahoma is from the Y Plus Global Network, and she's also a CCM representative of young people living with HIV in Kenya. Ms. Ahoma, as a young woman living with HIV in Kenya, you are at the forefront of the HIV fight. How can we leverage the lived experience of a young person living with HIV, such as yourself, to lead on promoting HIV prevention?
Thank you very much, Mia. First of all, allow me just to say that I am really excited to hear all the previous speakers talking about young women issues with so much passion. And I am very positive that going into the high-level meeting that we will get a lot of good outcomes. So once again, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share my experiences as a young woman living with HIV, and also to explain how these experiences can be leveraged to improve HIV prevention programs. It is 5 years since the last political declaration on HIV and AIDS, and unfortunately, we have missed the global targets on HIV prevention among young women by a huge margin, prompting very many questions like why? Why are we still failing? Why is the pace of progress still very slow despite the advanced HIV prevention technologies and interventions that we have at our disposal? Recent data shows that 4,500 young girls and women in sub-Saharan Africa acquire HIV every week. This translates into about 27 girls acquiring HIV every hour, meaning that in the time it takes us to finish this session, about 40 girls would have acquired HIV in my region. That is very scary, isn't it? Now, young women in all their diversity continue to encounter too many barriers when accessing HIV prevention services. Some are not equipped with the knowledge or education they need to make informed choices. Others are not allowed to make autonomous decisions regarding their health because of their sexual partners. Some cannot afford health services or commodities. Some are discouraged because of the stigmatizing attitudes of healthcare workers. Others are simply barred from accessing services because of laws and policies such as age of consent. But the contrary is seen in HIV treatment programs. While HIV treatment programs are not perfect, they are recording better results. Is it because we don't have any option but to take our medication? In my experience, that is not the full picture. I adhere to my treatment for very many reasons. First off, the HIV treatment care and support services I receive are free and are available to everyone who needs them. I get my medication in bulk. I only go to the facility every 3 months. I get psychosocial support through counseling and support groups. I receive services that are tailor-made to my needs, delivered by peer counselors on request. I get select sexual reproductive health and rights services at my facility free of charge, but most importantly, I receive these services in a stigma-free environment where everyone is trained and equipped on how to handle my needs. I may not get the latest treatment regimen, but all these factors help me to remain virally suppressed. I know I make living with HIV sound rosy, but it isn't. I am lucky. Even then, I still have to take a pill every day until better long-acting treatment options become available or until a cure is found. The successes that we have achieved in HIV treatment have been hard-won by strong community advocates. Even among young people, we have youth-led networks such as the Global Network of Young People Living with HIV, also known as Y Plus Global, who are shaping the response for young people living with HIV in all our diversity globally. A clear indication that young people can lead the response. As a young woman living with HIV, I also represent my constituency in various decision-making platforms, such as the Kenya CCM. Here, I ensure that our issues are prioritized and funded. We must learn from this and fund other peer and youth-led projects, such as the Have Voice Fund and Resilient Empowered Adolescent Young People, also known as READY Initiative, and others which are supporting greater youth leadership in sexual reproductive health and HIV. HIV prevention and sexual reproductive health services are critical to the lives of every young woman or girl. These services should be free, they should be fully integrated, should be delivered at scale and tailored to meet the holistic needs of young women. New commodities and prevention technologies should be rolled out and made available to every young woman. Having these tools will mean nothing if they don't get into the hands of the young women like me and my friends. Finally, I call on everyone attending the high-level meeting to recognize ethical youth leadership as an non-negotiable in the HIV response, and to financially support youth-led programming and advocacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Huma. And for closing the comments of our panelists today, we are now going to move on to hear comments from invited participants. And we're going to start with Mr. Darren Walsh, who is the Director of Global Health at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office of the United Kingdom. Mr. Walsh is going to comment on the importance of HIV prevention, maintaining a central place in the global AIDS strategy. Mr. Walsh.
Thank you, Mia. Thanks to UNAIDS and the GPC for hosting this really important event. And what powerful testimony we just heard from Joyce. She's a real inspiration, actually. So thank you for that, Joyce. And to the other panel as well. I think you've brought together a fantastic panel, and we've heard some really powerful interventions and strong calls for courageous leadership on preventing HIV. So the UK remains committed to the goal of ending AIDS as a public health threat by 2030. We stand with you in that endeavour, and we're very proud of our continuing commitment to the Global Fund, our contribution there to the Robert Carr Fund and others. And of course, this year we have the G7 presidency, and we will be placing huge priority on global health action and the role of leaders within that. I want to make 3 points, really. The first is that prevention is key. In health, it's always better to prevent. So we pay tribute to the work of UNAIDS on prevention, and we really welcome the new global AIDS strategy and the strong focus that places on HIV prevention and a real sense of urgency. As we've heard from the panelists, the truth is we've not done as well as we would have liked to have done on prevention. So now is the time to redouble our efforts on that important component of the strategy. That's my first point. The second is, as we've heard, time is short and resources are scarce. And as Peter Sands in his intervention said, we need to make our money go as far as it can and to act with great precision. So that means acting on the basis of what works, engaging with the problem as it is, rather than how we might like it to be. It means addressing the inequalities that are driving new infections and getting effective combination prevention packages and services to those key populations that need them, and in a way that's accessible to them, meeting people who need the services where they are. And we've got an opportunity to do this in a way that removes stigma, which Lord Fowler spoke powerfully about, which embraces diversity, and which reflects our values of equality and inclusion and a genuine desire as we move towards the SDGs to leave nobody behind. The third point I want to make is, I can predict that in the coming period, the global community is going to be spending a lot of resource on health systems as we seek to build pandemic preparedness, learn the lessons from COVID, put stronger health systems in place, strengthening global resilience to the health threats which will surely come. And we've got an opportunity together to do that in a way that strengthens the delivery of all healthcare services, including HIV prevention. It's a big opportunity, it's a leadership opportunity, and it's one I believe we absolutely must take. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Walsh. We're going to move on to Dr. Lillian Benjamin now, who is a young women advocate at the Athena Network, and that is a global network that advances gender equality, human rights, and diversity within the context of HIV. Dr. Benjamin is going to comment on how to prepare for the introduction of new HIV prevention options for young women. Dr. Benjamin?
Thank you so much, Maya. I'll move forward to, okay, first of all, thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm really excited to be here. As introduced, my name is Dr. Lilian Benjamin Mwakiosi from the United Republic of Tanzania. Given the context of our conversation today, and as we are preparing for introduction of new HIV prevention tools, first of all, it's pretty evident via community voices and even scientific numbers, as we might have heard from previous speakers, that adolescent girls and young women remain highly at risk for new HIV infections in Sub-Saharan and Eastern Africa. For instance, I'll give an example in my country. According to Tanzania HIV Impact Survey, year 2016-17, adolescent girls and young women take up 32% of new HIV infections annually, approximately 2 to 3 young women getting infected per hour. Seconding Joyce, this is high-key unacceptable, and we need to act immediately. For us to be able to deliver effective prevention interventions and therefore cater to the needs of our communities, and that's young women, we need to strongly employ the use of differentiated service delivery models in HIV infections. We have seen the fruits of differentiated service delivery in HIV care and treatment. It's high time we employ similar human-centered approaches in HIV prevention as well. This strongly applies now, right in time, as we prepare for the introduction of new prevention tools, including the dapivirine ring, very exciting to young women, long-acting pre-exposure prophylaxis, and many more upcoming tools underway, having the community at the center of every intervention while expanding prevention options. This is pretty much what has been said by many other speakers, that we need to put communities at the centers and face of the interventions and new tools that we are coming up with. Introduction of new HIV prevention tools must pay attention to the quality and comprehensiveness of HIV prevention packages prepared for communities, and especially young women. We need to pay attention to the places that the services are meant to be provided, time that the services are meant to be provided, but also who provides these services and how the services are being provided, all according to what the communities and these young women or targeted populations want. Making sure that we pay attention to diversity within the target groups that we are working to deliver these services for. By doing so, we'll be able to provide services that are tailored to the needs of our communities, hence increased uptake of services for even the most marginalized communities. This also reminds me to talk about the issue around policy environment, that is necessary for us to do regular policy environment check in advance. We do not have to wait for tools licensure or introduction, having the tools ready in the countries for us to start questioning whether policies are friendly enough. It's time to be ahead of time and think ahead of time and prepare in advance and look at the policies in advance to make sure by the time we have these tools available for our communities, the policies are friendly enough to ensure easy and fast access to the communities. And last but also not least, it's very vital to ensure that countries continue investing in both community engagement and locally produced data to inform ideation planning, implementation, monitoring, and even valuation of these new tools and HIV prevention programs at large. Thank you so much, Maya.
Thank you very much, Dr. Benjamin. Next up, we have Ms. Happy Hassan from Tanzania, who is the Executive Director of the Tanzanian Network of People Who Use Drugs. And she's going to comment on the barriers that communities of people who inject drugs face in accessing harm reduction services. I would like to request Ms. Hassan and all the speakers that we have left to please stick to 3 minutes, since we only have 15 minutes left until the end of the session. So please keep your comments as brief as possible. Ms. Hassan? Happy Hassan? I'm going to move on to the next. Yes, Ms. Hassan, are you there? Yes.
Yes, I'm here. Hi,
we can hear you.
Hello. Yes, thank you so much. It's good to be here. My name is Happy Hassan, as you have heard, and I'm working with the network of people who use drugs here in Tanzania, and I'm the director of the network. Good morning for many, and good afternoon and good evening for the rest who are in East Africa. I'm starting now. I represent the growing community of people who use drugs in Africa. 3 of Africa's 5 regions are forecast to be particularly affected by the rapid rise in the number of people using drugs. With nearly 6 million users today, West Africa accounts for the majority of drug users in Africa, and it's expected to rise to over 13 million. East Africa is forecast to experience the most rapid rise, as overall number are projected to nearly triple, going from above 2 million today to about 5.5 million in 2050. In Sub-Saharan Africa, expected number to increase by, in Sub-Saharan Africa, we expect number to increase by 150% overall. The African continent will experience the largest increase in the absolute number of people who use drugs of any region globally. But data, funding, political will, and the right mindset to fight the increasing prevalence of HIV among people who use drugs are lagging, with national and regional drug policy still relying almost exclusive on harsh criminalization. On the other side, international conventions are often having minimal resources for harm reduction on the grounds that they condone drug abuse, beside the immediate decriminalization of drug use and drug possession. The only hope for many continents is the rapid introduction and scale-up of harm reduction services. Services provided in a non-stigmatizing and low-threshold manner with the take-home doses and secondary distribution made available by design and brought to scale without going through endless pilots. Services that must be delivered through community-led organization and networks of people who use drugs. A few years ago, Africa still faced a low prevalence of HIV. Prevalence of HIV in people who use drugs. At that time, relevant modest investments would have helped halt and reverse HIV transmission among people who use drugs. The more we wait, the more financial and human resources will be needed. The rapid roll-up of harm reduction services will also place public health system on continent under anonymous stress, adding to other crises like COVID. That's why I firmly believe that the only way to overcome this problem is by rolling it out through community-led organizations, in line with the new UNAIDS strategies that said 80% of prevalent services being implemented through community-led organization and networks without waiting for 2030. To conclude, we should never forget that all HIV epidemics among people who use drugs are manufactured as they build upon the widespread criminalization of drug use, drug possession, and ultimate people who use drugs. While we arm at large-scale harm reduction programs, we should never forget that the most critical action to combat HIV transmission among people who use drugs is criminalizing drug use and drug possession. Thank you for your attention. Back to you, Chair.
See you so much, Mrs. Sun, and thank you for pointing out the importance of community-led organizations in our prevention efforts. We're now going to hear from South Sudan. We're going to hear from Fatma Tengiba Idi, and she is the National Coordinator for the Feminist Initiative in South Sudan. And she is going to comment on how to create HIV prevention programs that make a difference in communities. Ms. Tengiba Idi?
Okay, thank you so much for this opportunity. My name is Feminist Initiative South Sudan. Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. You can start. You can go ahead.
Okay. All right. My name is Tengiba Idi, and I'm the National Coordinator for Feminist Initiative South Sudan, a community-led organization in South Sudan, working with key population, especially the female sex workers. HIV programming for key population in South Sudan is supported by PEPFAR and Global Fund. The population of female sex workers in South Sudan is estimated to be 13,000 with evidence from IDBS and program size estimates. So the package of services that the key population in South Sudan include HIV testing services, family planning, STI screening and treatment, GBV screening and support, condom promotion and distribution. The program has identified peer educators and peer navigators as peer outreach workers to help reach the female sex workers with services and community level support. Through support and engagement of the peer educators and navigators, 2,500 female sex workers have been identified and are receiving ART in South Sudan. Through collaboration and coordination with the Ministry of Health, South Sudan AIDS Commission, UNAIDS, and the Network of AIDS Service Organization, advocacy on key population have been held to high leadership as part of enabling environment creation for key population service provision. The support from UNFPA for condoms and lubricants is enormous and has met the needs of female sex workers for condoms. But between key population and policymakers as part of enabling environment creation to reduce harmful practices such as unprecedented arrests, extortion of money, use of condoms as evidence for persecution, and we also advocate for legal reforms to support prevention efforts and protect the human rights. We encourage the donor world to advance support their critical role in providing prevention targets for appropriate utilizers on target and beneficiaries with services. Without organization, there will be no prevention. But with the full involvement and participation of key population and key population leadership in the programs meant for key population, then there will be an end to the epidemic. Thank you so much.
We seem to have lost our connection there. I am going to move on to the next speaker in the meanwhile. We are going to hear from Alexa Dominic, who is the chair of Trans Voice, that is a community-based organization for trans women in Indonesia. And she's going to comment on the special considerations that are needed to make HIV prevention work for, to do HIV prevention work for transgender people. Ms. Dominic?
Yeah, Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be a part of this meeting. Let me introduce my names. My name is Alexa Dominics, and I am chair of TransVoice. TransVoice are a community-based organization of transgender women community in Indonesia. Transgender women community is the most left behind community in the implementation of HIV program. A lack of the opportunity and safe space for the representative of transgender women in strategic space at the national and international level, it's really greatly affect the accommodation of the issue and needs of the transgender woman community. Talking about human rights issue and also gender equality issue, when the situation of the political happening in Indonesia, there is some of the implementation program from the religion organization. They are give us a statement to criminalize the transgender woman community space and also the LGBTI community. So it's really have an impact for the LGBTI community to access in the health services. And the other issue are there is a lot of the donor agency and UN agency and SIV program implementer are very not sensitive and don't care about the issue and needs of the trans woman community. For example, in the terms of the administration, they still have a problem using the names accordingly to the identity card. While we know that many of the trans woman individuals who are not comfortable to using the birth name listed on the identity card. Many trans women use the name of their choices to match with their gender identity. While we know that the procedure for changing the name on the identity card is not easy and it's really have a bureaucracy to change our names in the governments. In addition, in the implementation of the HIV program, the needs of the trans woman community are still united with the MSM group, while the issue and need between trans woman community and MSM group are very different. For example, in the modular of the Global Fund, they still put the transgender woman community strategy. It's similar with the MSM group community.
Thank you so much for that and for highlighting the needs and what we need to do among the trans community. I have just been told that we can extend our session with about 10 minutes. We have 2 speakers left, so we will be able to fit both of them in. So our second last speaker is going to be Dr. Nataya Pakpung, and she's going to comment on Thailand's leadership in HIV prevention among key and vulnerable populations over the years. And she's the executive director at the Institute of HIV Research and Innovation in Bangkok.
Thank you very much, Mia. And let me use my maximum speed here to thank all the powerful strategic messages delivered by all the panelists. And it is my great honor to share Thailand's best practices with all of you today to demonstrate that these strategies can really be made tangible. And I would like to start by saying that a successful HIV program right now must be designed through the HIV status neutral approach lens, meaning that equal importance will need to be given to individuals coming in for HIV testing, regardless of their HIV status. Those tested HIV negative must be offered same-day PrEP to quickly bring them to the goal of having negligible risk of HIV acquisition. And those tested positive must be offered same-day ART initiation to achieve zero risk of sexual transmission through U equals U as soon as possible. And same-day ART has been recommended in Thailand guidelines since last year, but successful implementation has seen mainly only in facilities where U equals U message has been used correctly and routinely, which points to more work needed around educating and implementing U equals U in Thailand. And Thailand has successfully implemented same-day PrEP, mainly through the key population-led health services or KPLHS started in 2016. And service packages under KPLHS were designed by key populations themselves to ensure that services are client-centered. And services are also co-delivered by lay providers who are often members of key populations and therefore understand well the social and sexual context of their clients. KPLHS has contributed to more than half of HIV testing and 2/3 of PrEP service among MSM and transgender women in Thailand. And these data were used to support the inclusion of PrEP as part of UHC in our country since 2019. And these successes have led Thailand to legalize KPLHS in 2019 to allow trained lay providers to collect samples, conduct point-of-care HIV and STI testing, and give out PrEP and PEP as prescribed by doctors. And national curriculum and standards to guide the training and assessment of lay providers were already made ready. The only final step we have been waiting for more than a year now is for our trained lay providers to be officially certified by our Ministry of Public Health. And this step is needed to support KPLHS sustainability because domestic financing will come directly from the government to the lay providers, truly as part of the national healthcare system. And to end the HIV epidemic, we need to simplify. We need to demedicalize and differentiate HIV testing, ART, and PrEP. Thailand has been fortunate to have committed civil society organizations and strong research and capacity building organizations and supportive international funding agencies, advocates, champions from our local public health facilities. And just from time to time, an understanding policymaker or political leader. It has been very encouraging to see KPLHS being replicated to our neighboring countries like Vietnam, like the Philippines. And we are very optimistic that with KPLHS scale up and sustainability, Thailand and countries in our region will be able to control and end HIV epidemic soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those insightful comments. And that brings us to our last speaker, who is Edwin Bernard, and he works for the HIV Justice Network, which is a global information and advocacy hub working to end the inappropriate use of criminal law to regulate and punish people living with HIV. He is going to tell us about cases where law reform in the context of criminalization or access to prevention have recently changed.
Thank you, Mia, and thanks for the extra time. So we've already heard that the criminalization of key populations is a major barrier to HIV prevention, treatment, and care. And similarly, the criminalization of women and men living with HIV in all of our diversities for alleged HIV non-disclosure, potential or perceived exposure, or non-intentional HIV transmission is widely discredited as a public health response, since such laws and prosecutions are ineffective and counterproductive. And yet, 110 countries around the world have, and 50 currently use, overly broad and unscientific HIV criminalization laws or policies that essentially make people living with HIV solely liable for HIV prevention. A national survey of people living with HIV in the United States asked whether they thought it was reasonable to avoid testing for HIV because of HIV criminalization, and half agreed that it was reasonable. And a study from Canada found that gay men at high risk of acquiring HIV believe healthcare workers work closely with the police. So these and similar laws are effectively rendering all the HIV prevention tools we have at our disposal useless. Over the past few years, thanks to the efforts of many, we have seen HIV-specific criminal laws repealed or modernized in more than 30 jurisdictions across 20 countries, including in the United States and across Western and Eastern Europe. And concerted advocacy and strategic litigation in Latin America and in parts of sub-Saharan Africa have led to several problematic laws not being enacted or being found unconstitutional on various human rights grounds. But there's still so much more to do. Data collated and analyzed by the HIV Policy Lab, including from our own global HIV criminalization database, strongly suggests that where countries recognize the harmful effects of criminalization and have acted to modernize or repeal punitive laws and policies, greater progress has been made towards achieving the 1990 targets and countries that have not. The publication of an expert consensus statement on the science of HIV in the context of criminal law in 2018 has strengthened our arguments that HIV criminalization is not grounded in up-to-date science. But ultimately, however, we must combine scientific advances with an unwavering recognition of universal human rights in order to achieve HIV justice for all.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bernard, for ending our panel discussion in such a powerful way. I would like to point out that in cases where you couldn't hear speakers very clearly, we will be posting their speeches and their comments on the website of the Global HIV Prevention Coalition so that you can go and access it and also just go back to speeches where you wanted to see something again. I would like to thank all our panelists for sharing their ideas and their insights. And I'm now going to hand over to Professor Sheila Plough, who is the co-chair of the Global HIV Prevention Coalition, and she will make closing remarks and close the event for us.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Mia Malan, for the great moderation and facilitation. And I'm right here with you in Johannesburg. So let me thank you, Your Excellencies, colleagues, and partners for the great and inspiring messages that will give us the energy to move ahead and implement the precision prevention targets, the new ones. Indeed, no prevention, no end. We are together in this quest for zero new HIV infections. And I have heard about 6 things in our leadership that can turn this epidemic. And these include, first, showing that political will and commitment for HIV prevention, basically translated into funding and adequately resourcing HIV prevention programs, addressing and removing the legal and structural and policy obstacles that hold back more rapid progress, and investing in national stewardship and coordination support so that the prevention programs do not fragment into piecemeal projects that we sometimes see in countries. Second, ensuring prioritization of HIV and COVID-19 services for priority populations amid the COVID-19 lockdowns and restrictions. With the COVID-19 crisis, we know that it requires new resources, renewed energy, and strong leadership. Therefore, it is essential to make sure that the resources for HIV prevention are not reduced, as this threatens the very gains that we have made this far. Third, strengthening national capacity to manage and coordinate effective and sustainable HIV prevention programs, recognizing that such fit-for-purpose programs involve multi-system capacities within universal primary healthcare systems and community healthcare systems. Yes, community healthcare systems are important because, as we always say, health is made in the community. Hospitals are for repairs. Ensuring that countries are able to generate and use appropriate and up-to-date data that has been talked about so much, so as to focus high-impact interventions on locations and populations with the highest risk of HIV infections, and to monitor the coverage and outcomes of those programs. The 5th one is really harnessing the strengths of community-led organizations and networks to deliver people-centered services at scale, including through social contracting, through enhanced community-based data collection, and through monitoring of prevention interventions. And lastly, strengthening the links with other health and social development programs, such as sexual and reproductive health, comprehensive sexuality education, prevention of gender-based violence, antenatal care, COVID-19, tuberculosis, malaria, and viral hepatitis. At UNAIDS, and specifically at the Global HIV Prevention Coalition, we feel very energized, and we look forward to supporting and working with countries and leaders at all levels in reaching those agreed precision prevention targets. I thank you, and I'm pleased to close this great meeting.